these mates always make me want to, but
Let me just grab my...
logging on to it. No, I've moved on to my own a little bit. How's your week going then, Hannah?
Good, yeah, I only got here sort of, well, I just, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
What was that on the phone?
it's on the beer. Very good. It's on the beer. Just the beer and milk and between Barlow and Cork. Yeah, no, I was similar. I got in kind of late morning and it whizzed by. Yeah. Obviously, well, since I'm a kid, I've always asked me to do my body sort of.
Binge in the afternoon and then dinner,
And then it's time to go to bed. Yeah.
beautiful. And then I went to like that biggest beach in the
What
summer.
do you have to do next week as well?
And it was just full of sunshine.
Yeah.
Very good.
Are we ready?
I always love people who do the full stretch. I think by the end they must be so poorly.
Are we ready? Is the microphone working? Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this IPPR North and Bright Blue event on Labour and levelling up. What's the plan? A really big, meaty topic for us to kick off Monday at conference. My name is Harry Coulter-Pinner. I'm Director of Research and Engagement here at IPPR, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all today. So we've got a big set of questions, and we've got an amazing panel to try and answer them. So we'll go to each of our panelists in turn, starting with Alex Norris, who's Shadow Minister for Levelling Up Housing and Communities in just a second. We'll then open up to questions from you guys and have a bit of a debate here this morning. So without further ado, Alex, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Harry. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're enjoying Party Conference. I see a lot of familiar faces who've been working in the space of whether you call it levelling up, regional growth, spatial inequalities, however you want to brand it. I know there's a lot of expertise in this room, so I think we'll have a very good discussion. So I'm a Member of Parliament, Labour and Co-op Member of Parliament for Nottingham North, and the Shadow Levelling Up Minister working to Lisa Nandy on this agenda and formulating Labour's response, which I think, as you'd imagine, is quite an interesting space to be in. Certainly prior to the last few days, I think this conversation would have been different even 7 days ago about how to express what I think is quite traditional Labour territory, which is a frustration with regional inequalities, which is a frustration that for too many people in this country, where you're born dictates your life outcomes, and how to do that in the context of a Conservative government who were talking about majoring on the same area and trying to put energy into this space. Now, that's changed a little bit since then, but I don't think it's changed for us. I think this remains huge to our offer at the next general election, so it's very important, I think, to have these conversations. For me, this agenda can get very complicated very quickly. You can have 350-page white papers. You can have 350-page bills. It helps if you chuck in stuff off Wikipedia or you chuck in stuff. There's a huge planning bill just in the levelling up bill as well. But actually, I think keeping it more simple is better. So I apologise to the people in this room, certainly at the end of this week, who might hear this pitch a lot. But for me, it's about two things. It's about money and it's about power. And on the money side of things, that first of all, and again, I know there's people from across the country here, putting an end to the debilitating beauty parades of funding for local communities. So at the moment, if you think within your local authority, there will be people, and it probably won't be their prime job, but putting in bids for the Towns Fund, the High Streets Fund, the Brownfields Sites Fund. There's over 100 of those sort of short-term funding rounds that are targeted at things the government wants local authorities to do, but those local authorities may or may not prioritise, but they do want the money and they do want the investment because that's what their community needs. We're in this odd situation in Nottingham where we've got similar authorities. And don't tell anyone at home that I said this, but we're quite similar to Leicester and Derby. A lot of our challenges are similar. Our outlook is similar. But we daren't talk to Leicester and Derby about our plans for, say, the Towns Fund or the High Streets Fund, because if we give them a good idea, they might win and we might lose. What an odd way for sort of regional growth that is. So we need to get past that to more sustained, flexible funding, whether that's to combined authorities at a sub-regional level, whether that's to local authorities, so they can invest in the things that will make the difference to change their communities. And then on the power aspect, this is a golden moment for the transition of power from the centre to local communities, and as an understanding that we're too centralised as a country, that actually to grow our economy so that those chances are more fairly spread around will be through local leadership, because that will be planned locally. We have a much better understanding in the East Midlands of where our economy will go in the future than they do in Whitehall. Of course, they have so much to cover. But we need the powers and the tools to do that, and we want to see those shifted, as I say, from Whitehall to Town Hall. And you look, the mayors are a good example of some of the things they're either doing or asking for around the net zero agenda. They would love to be in the space of taking on all the cladding and those environmental housing and infrastructure elements. Huge, I think, absolutely huge scope amongst skills. If you're going to say that local sub-regions and sub-regions are going to set their future in terms of what they're going to do, that for the West Yorkshire, they're going to build around Channel 4 in the creative space. For somewhere like Nottingham, we're going to build around our universities and be hopefully at the high end of green manufacturing. Well, we need to have a greater say, therefore, over the skills of our population. So nationally commissioned further education. Well, does that work in that context? So lots of things to go out there about shift from the centre to town halls. I'm always slightly, because as you'll know, Lisa's talking this afternoon, I'm slightly perhaps holding back on some of the things, but please do have a listen there. And then just to finish, Harry, because I've probably already spoken for longer than you wanted me to, but within that power conversation, the shift of power has to be a double devolution conversation. Yes, we are talking about from central government, from Westminster, from Whitehall to Town Hall and City Hall. But if we stop there, we won't, I believe, have met the test, because people are fed up. People want a greater say over their lives. There's a frustration, whether it manifests in 2016, whether it manifests in how you talk, the conversations you have when you knock on doors at the moment for the Labour Party. That there's a sense that my voice doesn't matter. The things that happen in my community happen to me, not with me. We have to see a fundamental shift of power from our local town halls into communities too. You will see from Lisa, and you may well hear some more later, about our community right to buy. The idea that these beloved local assets at the moment get lost, get bought up, invariably turned into things that aren't community priority, to the point where you could lose your local football club, and the heart and the pain that caused for Bury, and the devastation that would have caused in Derby. We were hours away from that in Derby. Having that way and having that financial support to make it happen. So I think in the aggregate, it's quite an exciting space to be in. I think that's very natural Labour territory. We don't know where the government are going to go with it. That is for them, really. They can leave the pitch if they wish to, but we're going to stay in it, and it's going to be at the very forefront of what we offer in a year, 2 years' time.
Before I open up to the panel, I'm just going to abuse my position of chair just to pick up on a couple of points that you've just raised, Alex. The first is, obviously, the government published their white paper with a set of missions that defined for them what levelling up would look like across the country. Does Labour share those set of missions? Or do you have a different vision of what a levelled up country would look like?
Well, I mean, I think if you took the white paper and you broke it down into sort of 3 strands, what's the background? What would we like to happen in this country? How are we going to do it? Well, actually, the background, there's not an awful lot to argue with. That's fine. The missions, well, they're 13 exceptionally broad missions, but again, if we were to talk collectively and work out what we'd like to do to the country, we'd probably work in the same place. We want to improve healthy life expectancy and eradicate differences. We want to have better and fairer investment in science and technology around the country. I don't think there's a huge amount to disagree with. The problem is that that's easy to say. When you get in government, it's priorities. And the third section, which is, well, how are we going to do it? The action plan is just a long list of things, many of which were already happening, but with a very unclear sense of how that's going to make an impact. So for me, I think I would keep it, again, a bit simpler. What are the things that hold back a community like mine? Well, and we know this from the sharp end, from all the bids that we put in at the moment. And, we've got really good bid going into the Levelling Up Fund. And, you want to be careful because it's on camera. But if the choice was, so there's a bid of up to £20 million, we would not bid for what we've bid for. We would bid, the biggest problem in our community is our skill base, both for those who've missed out on education and those who are leaving the workforce at an age when it's going to be really hard to bring them back. So again, it's about those priorities. But the thing for me is I think those should be locally driven. And it's about having the funding to say that it will be different to Brent as it is in Nottingham, and that the local leader is the best place to decide that.
And finally, before I come onto the panel, there was a big change of direction on Friday at the budget. It looked very different to the Conservative Party that won in 2019. Does Labour see that as a broken promise? How much did you see levelling up in the kind of trickle-down approach that the Conservatives are now pursuing?
I mean, it's a matter of record that we were pretty sceptical throughout on this agenda. We think that this was exceptionally effective, certainly felt that in those dark days of 2019, literally and figuratively, that this was a well-tested, well-polled, well-focused group policy that tapped into a sense of one of the things that holds our country back, that people connected with, but that beyond the brand, there wasn't a lot to it, which is why, we've made the criticism that we've made. I think, that is a matter for debate. I feel pretty strong about my case in that. I think now there is no debate left, really. If committing to trickle-down economics, well, that's going to commit you to the same outcomes that you've got before. It hasn't worked in the past. It certainly isn't going to mean that those communities that haven't shared in the proceeds of growth previously are more likely to do now. What is it about trickle-down economics that gives coastal communities who are finding their way of life very, very different now that means that they'll benefit from that? So, no, I think the government have quit the space. They'll keep the brand around for a while because it's embarrassing not to, but that is not a reason for us to not, to do anything less than be fully committed to this agenda because it's so important to the country.
Thanks, Alex. I'm now going to come to our very own Zoe Billingham, who's Director of IPR North. We've obviously launched a progressive levelling up project and have been up and down the country talking to people about what levelling up means to them. Maybe you can tell us a bit about what we're finding and what we think should happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Harry, and great to be here with you all today. Just firstly, just picking up on some of what Alex was just saying around the kind of political context and opportunity. Obviously, Friday saw a total about turn from the government from a investment-led approach to levelling up to a deregulation and tax-cutting version of it. I personally think that's a very pessimistic spin, actually, about why people, businesses, the government indeed, should invest in places like where I live here in Liverpool. And actually, a more positive narrative is one about the investment, the opportunity, and so I'm really pleased to hear Alex pitch it that way. And of course, the only thing really in Friday's budget for levelling up was investment zones. Now we've seen them time and time again, whether they're called enterprise zones, whether they're called free ports, it's much of a muchness. And I don't think they're going to level up by themselves. And I think also we have to be careful, as Alex says, I think, there's strength and clarity on this agenda, and I think two things are really being muddled. One is that we're in, a terrible cost of living crisis, which is biting businesses as well as individuals, and one is a kind of positive story about how we grow and build our economy. And I think these two things are being muddled, and actually, if I was a business owner in Liverpool, of course, I would welcome an investment zone and a lowering of my tax bill today to help me address the cost of living crisis. Is that a policy to help grow Liverpool of the future? I don't think so. So I think we kind of need to be careful not to kind of muddy these two ideas and concepts. Now, just picking up on what Harry was saying, we're really delighted to be working with Power to Change and others on our Progressive Levelling Up project. We're running this until spring next year to really kind of look at how levelling up could be done differently, as I say, to lean into a positive narrative about investment and wealth and power and the things that so far have been totally absent from the levelling up agenda. Now, in terms of what we're hearing, we've so far done citizen conversations in Hastings and in Redcar, and we've got one in Stoke-on-Trent the week after next. And we're hearing, much of kind of the context of levelling up, that of course, we're all proud of where we're from. Redcar, it's a proud industrial town. It was built on steel, and of course the closing of the last blast furnace in 2015 was devastating for it. In Hastings, we have a slightly different context in that it's the sort of seaside town of time gone by, but yet now it's fast gentrifying, and yet we still have deep pockets of poverty in the place, but also house prices and all the kind of disbenefits, let's say, of gentrification are happening there too. So we're hearing some really interesting stories and narratives. I think the things that run common to where we've been so far is certainly an involvement of the local community. And I think this is something that, as progressives, we need to really work and focus on. I think, there are ideas already out there, of course, and some local authorities already run their own standing citizen juries, or they have citizen assemblies, or they bring in citizens at certain times of different areas of policy making. But I think what people want to better understand is, how does this work on an ongoing basis? How is it not just consultation on this project and then you don't hear anything from anyone for a while, and then they kind of come back to you to tell you what they decided? So I think it's how we do that on a continuum, as opposed to just coming to communities when it kind of suits authorities. So that's a really interesting thing that we're now picking up as part of our progressive levelling up project. I think also, and again, this kind of recognition of the assets that are in places already. So Redcar's been calling for a pier for about 10 years now. You know, it's a seaside town. It would love to be leaning into its status and building on that as a natural asset and seeing that as an asset as opposed to a drag of times gone by. And thirdly, I just wanted to say, and this goes back to my first point, around public services. I mean, obviously we're speaking to people now in the middle of not only a cost of living crisis, but with, you know, NHS waiting times as they are, you know, people are crying out for like, what can we really expect from the state? You know, what's the minimum offer? You know, I think this kind of, people have lost a sense of like what they can really expect, what do they deserve, what's disappointing, what's expectations too far. So I think we've been kind of chewing over an idea about kind of local minimum services offer. Like, what could that look like to communities when you say, actually, we can guarantee you that the state will provide a certain minimum for you. So that's another kind of area that we're working up. So finally, just before I hand over, what does this mean for Labour? I think, you know, there's a massive opportunity here. Now, as I say, that levelling up has been reduced to tax cuts and deregulation and a somewhat pessimistic agenda. So I'm really pleased that it's still front and centre of Labour's plans. I think, as I say, I've mentioned a few policy ideas, whether that's minimum services standards. Excited to hear more this afternoon about Labour's plans for community assets. I think working out how we involve communities on an ongoing basis and don't replicate the problems of Westminster and Whitehall in local government. And, you know, there could be things to also focus on the sharing of wealth and the proceeds of development locally, you know, whether that's a land value capture or something along those lines. So those are the sorts of ideas we're thinking of. If anybody who's not already part of the project would love to join us, please do. It's very much a work in progress. It's a really exciting moment, and we're really looking forward to working with many of you and our partners Power to Change on it in the coming months.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm going to come to you now, Brian. Brian Dorr, CEO of Safe Regeneration. What's your take on levelling up, and what would you like to see Labour pursuing in the coming years?
I'd like to pick up on the double devolution. That's because what we don't want to be in the position is feel like we compete with our local governments. And there needs to be incentivised, I believe, to work with. So if there is funding streams coming through, there needs to be a tick box or some weight against engaging with your communities. Because again, it's that thing of like, we'll consult and we'll come back a few weeks later and then we'll check in and say, this is what we've kind of decided to do. What we did as part of the developments of Breaking Ground, which is a community-led enabling, we developed a steering group of key stakeholders. They led that project. There's a pipeline out now of 36 other communities that are delivering community-led housing projects because the narrative was right. The narrative came up, it didn't come down. So people know what they're engaging in, rather than kind of, as you say, almost felt that you were competing against local governments. It's very much about the language and the narrative, and it's about a true, it's not engagement. It needs to be a more, because if we talk about community engagement, they're normally lower level officers, let's be, community engagement. That needs to be strategic, that needs to be led from higher up in local government, rather than something that we do at the end. It needs to be embedded in how we level up, I believe.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to come to Ryan now. We're delighted to be partnering with Bright Blue this week on this event, and we're partnering with them at Tory Party Conference next week. We think it's really important because if levelling up is to really happen, it has to be a cross-party, long-term agenda. And so we're trying to embody that here today. Ryan, do you want to say a bit about your take on what Labour should be doing, and also how Labour should be responding to the Conservatives' positioning in the last few days?
Great, thank you, Harry. And yes, we are an independent but centre-right think tank. So thank you for having us here at Labour Party Conference. And it's good to do this partnership with IPPR North and Power to Change. We're doing exactly the same event with different speakers, obviously, at Tories next week. We've not just got one minister, but two. Don't know if that's a sign of the Tories' commitment to levelling up, but we will see. And I must say, I'm a little bit still in shock, not only because of the temperature here in Liverpool, being a classic southerner, but it is flipping freezing, and also because of the mini budget, which, you know, a lot of people are still in shock about, including the markets, with sterling plummeting, which shows a lack of market confidence. So, levelling up, not a particularly new agenda. David Cameron had his life chances agenda. Theresa May talked about burning injustices. And really, governments of all stripes since the late 1960s have tried to regenerate so-called left-behind areas. Indeed, it is the role of government itself to try and provide the resources, regulation, and services to areas that are not well served by the market. That is the purpose of government itself. And if you look at the evidence around the regeneration initiatives since the 1960s, which there have been countless, the New Deal programme under Labour, the single regeneration budget under John Major's government, the evidence seems to suggest that they can have a marginal, modest positive impact, but only after a very long period of time. And what seems to make more difference is the level of private and public sector investment in those areas, particularly to the levels of employment. So, in essence, levelling up is very hard, requires multiple interventions, and you have to be very patient. So not great for politicians, really, who want those immediate vote-winning results. But politically speaking, I think for the Tories, levelling up is really the only game in town for their route to a majority again in 2024-25. It was those red wall seats in Northern England and Wales which gave the Tories the so-called stonking majority, and really it was on the back of the promise to get Brexit done. That has sort of been done now, but they need to show much more for those areas, and levelling up really is the way to do that. Although what I would say is there seems to be sometimes a perception that everybody is sort of drowning in misery in so-called left-behind areas. But if you look at the Red Wall, the seats that the Tories did best in were those where there was higher rates of home ownership. And I would say that not only have we had a change in government, but we're having a change in monetary policy in terms of higher interest rates. And The Economist did a very good article some weeks ago. And they showed, they basically argued that interest rates have been the secret weapon. Low interest rates have been the secret weapon for Tories, because a lot of people on relatively modest incomes have been able to afford nice cars, houses, as a result of being able to borrow at those low interest rates. In terms of the success of the Tories so far in levelling up, granted COVID has sort of got in the way, but over 3 years now after Boris has become Prime Minister, there's no real discernible progress, no distinctive new ideas or initiatives that you can associate with the Tories in those so-called left-behind areas. Cost of living is obviously now inflicting misery, and the mini-budget, as Zoe has said, had very little for levelling up. Liz Truss government seems to be going in a very different direction. So what is that direction? I think the Tories really are going for broke, a very fiscally expansionist and economically radical agenda, and really it's about trying to reinvent the Tory brand after 12 years in power, wind up the left a bit, I think in a pretty juvenile way, but I think that's what's motivating it to some extent, and to try and establish a record of delivery. To get the growth rates of 2.5%, which they're talking about, to fund the tax cuts and the public spending that they're committed to, is a big gamble. We've had very anemic growth in the UK for a long time and across the developed world. To get that sort of growth rates in the years ahead is going to be very, very difficult. And if they don't achieve it, with interest rates rising as they are and the borrowing becoming unsustainable, markets are reacting to that now, will be very politically painful for the Tories and very painful for taxpayers if it doesn't go right. So it's a big gamble. And I would say that if they want growth, which it's important to go for, and I would say actually there are similarities in a way with the Labour agenda, which is also about going for growth and through that borrowing, and then paying for that borrowing through growth. I would say it takes a lot more than the tax cuts. There's a whole sort of myriad of interventions that you need. For me in particular, it's about expanding and educating the workforce. But of course, where Labour is different is not just about going for growth and paying for the borrowing that way, but the distributional effects are starkly different. You know, the Tories' mini budget on Friday is starkly regressive. And you know, the biggest winners are larger companies and those on higher incomes. In terms of levelling up from what the Tories have been doing since 2019, what their focus has been, as I say, you know, there's been lots of regeneration initiatives since the 60s. What I think was particularly different in the focus for the Tories was two things. The first was, it's not just about economic regeneration, but civic regeneration as well. How do you restore civic activity and pride in these areas? And I think that was a particular focus, and there's been lots of work on that. I'll come on to that in a second. The second thing, which I think was particularly distinctive about the Tories' levelling up agenda, was it's not just about helping poor kids from left behind areas escape those areas and do well, the sort of Billy Elliot story. It's about raising up the whole town, and there's been this sort of assumption in Tory circles for a long time. It's about identifying those talented kids and finding a route out for them, whereas I think a lot of Tory thinkers and politicians think actually it's more about raising up the whole town and trying to keep talent in those areas rather than providing a rope for them to get out of them. So, finally, I think my remarks on what Labour can do now at this critical junction where the Tories seem to be still paying really lip service to levelling up. So there's an opportunity for the Labour to really own it. I think there is something which could be quite salient in the narrative about really the Tories could be prioritising private greed at the expense of the public good and the civic realm. I think there is a real danger of that narrative becoming very manifest. I think the other thing to say is that growth, of course, is needed. It's right that we pursue growth. That would make a real difference. If investment zones are not the thing that's really going to drive private sector enterprise, what would Labour do different to really drive private sector growth and investment into those areas? I think what could be distinctive about a Labour offer is three things. Firstly, about getting talented people to work in critical public services now depleted and in local government. And I think, you know, a lot of the big thinkers from Labour and politicians in the early mid-20th century were all about, you know, we're going to make the state, a sort of Fabianistic state, wonderfully ran, and we need to get the best talent to run those services and to run the state and run those services. And it was really a sort of backlash to this idea that a sort of amateurish aristocracy had been ruling Britain for too long, and actually we need to identify talented kids from poor areas to run the state and to run key services. And I think that's really what Labour should be saying again, to be unashamedly meritocratic, to make sure that people running key civic, local, public service institutions, particularly in these areas, are the most talented. So how do we get really talented teachers, people working in childcare, in social care, in those areas? What sort of things can Labour do to drive talent into the public and civic realm? The second, I think, is around the formulas that the government have been using for levelling up areas. So the Levelling Up Fund moved away from using the index for multiple deprivation, which I think was the wrong approach. I think that was a good objective measure. And it seems to be that there's a bit of kind of politics now associated with the allocation of resources, that you need a kind of MP sponsorship, which I think is wrong. And I think the third thing, and the thing I'm perhaps most passionate about, is the role of children as social glue. Often people, when they have children, engage with other parents and other services, and community is formed that way. So how can we, particularly in so-called left-behind areas, create the spaces and institutions for children where parents as well can come together? So thinking about, for example, children's centres, nurseries, other civic institutions where you can get people from different backgrounds mixing and developing relationships in that way. I think that's a really, thinking about the role of children and the spaces and places for them in driving civic activity and pride is something that Labour should also focus on.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And last, but by no means least, I'm going to come to you, Hannah. You've been kind of watching this from the outside, from the Sunday Times. What's your take on where we are today and where Labour should be going?
So I'm by no means an expert, but I'm based in Manchester and I sort of travel across the North and the Midlands. So as Harry says, it's from sort of an outsider's perspective, but I do a lot of sort of talking to people in communities across the North of England. I think for me, the sort of biggest observation is people in these areas felt neglected for a long time. I think Labour maybe took them for granted because these are places that voted Labour. And I think, a lot of these places voted for Brexit because they wanted something better. They took that, they saw that as an opportunity for something better prospects, better opportunities. That's maybe not delivered. And I think that was the same motivation that a lot of these places voted Conservative in 2019. And, we have had sort of external factors in the pandemic and things like that, but I think there is a sense that that promise hasn't been fulfilled either. And I think one of Labour's biggest problems is, what are people going to think now about the role of politics? And I think really the danger there is apathy. I really noticed that at the Wakefield by-election. It was people who had voted Labour. They had voted Conservative in 2019 and they just weren't going to vote at all because they felt that they'd totally lost faith in the system. And I would say, what people want is actually really simple things. When you speak to people, they want to feel safe, they want clean streets, they want good public services, they want buses to get them into town, they want job opportunities for their children. So it's actually, it's not the big, I think there's some things that you can't decentralise, politics, finance, things like that, but that's not what people want. They just want, those things that I mentioned. I think another risk, I think the role of Metro mayors has been really positive. But I think the divide that we risk now is between sort of towns and cities. I think we've got Channel 4, I think someone mentioned, going to Leeds. Manchester's doing very well. But then you go to somewhere like Burnley or like Wakefield. I think Wakefield is a city, but these sort of smaller, these not big metropolitan areas, these smaller cities and these towns, and the picture is very, very different. I think that's something that Labour needs to address. And then I think, the role of the private sector, I think that's something that, really needs to come into this because you can't do this just with public sector investment. I mean, you'll end up with, huge bills that, the state can't afford to pay. And I think the role of the private sector is about job opportunities that I mentioned, investment. I don't know how Labour does that, but it needs to, I think it's not just about pumping money into these places, it's encouraging sort of long-term investment, and the private sector has to play a role in that. In terms of levelling up itself, I don't know, I mean, I think it seems to have become a bit of a slogan, in sort of get Brexit done, take back control. I think, we risk sort of it becoming a slogan, and I think, as she said, Brexit's sort of been done. I think, we risk that with levelling up as well, that, it doesn't really mean anything, and no one really knows, like Brexit, no one really knows what they want to achieve by that. I think that's the risk with levelling up. So I think Labour really needs to define what it means by that and what it will do. What else did I want to say? Yeah, and I think, the the budget, as everyone else has mentioned. I think the 2019 election was sort of really pivotal in sort of making Westminster, making people realise that the whole of the rest of the country existed and that it mattered. As for, you know, I'm from Manchester, I spent quite a lot of time working in Westminster, being based in London, and that was a sense of frustration for me, but I think that risks being lost again. And I think it's really important that, you know, I think that space has kind of been vacated by the Conservatives, and I think that presents a real opportunity for Labour to move into that, and I think that will be the key battleground at the next election. I mean, I think what's interesting is I think the North East, I think that's going to be easier for the Conservatives to hold on to than the North West. I think the North West is the most interesting political battleground. Lancashire, Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, so that's sort of where I'll be looking to at the next election. Obviously, a lot can change between now and 2024, but at the minute, I think those are the most interesting seats. So they're sort of my thoughts as an outsider.
Thank you, Hannah, that's great. And I do think it's interesting, the last few years at Labour conference, I think a lot of people were bemoaning that there wasn't clear dividing lines between Labour and the Conservatives, and I think we can safely say, thanks to Liz Truss's budget, we have some more clear dividing lines this year. Right, I'm going to open up to all of you guys in the audience. If you put your hand up, I can get Ellie, who's got a mic, to come over. Please say who you are and who you're speaking on behalf of if you're here with an organisation. I'll take a round of 3 questions to start. Okay, the gentleman just here.
Great, thank you very much. My name's Timothy Douglas. I'm from an organisation called Property Mark, which is a professional body for property agents, residential and commercial. Just wanted to pick up on what Ryan was saying, and a question for you, Alex. Particularly building on the budget on Friday, a lot of talk around business rates, the high streets, stamp duty, freeze and holidays, which we've had during COVID. There's a lot of criticism that stamp duty holidays just inflate prices. So would Labour scrap stamp duty and, or replace it with something else? What's Labour's thoughts around stamp duty, business rates, and home ownership? Thank you.
Great. If we have hands up again, we'll take another 2. I can see 1 hand, so if we've got a third person who wants to ask a question, gentlemen here in the meantime.
Yeah, Mike Leonard from the Building Alliance. I think a number of us were very worried about the mini budget, as it was so-called, on Friday. And the word resilience comes to mind. And I hear nothing from either party about how we're going to rebuild those communities from a resilience perspective and get our supply chains back on shore and manufacture stuff in the UK again. In fact, the green agenda from Labour would see us moving to heat pumps made abroad. The MMC agenda I've just heard about is all about bringing steel from China and timber from Russia. So how are we going to make the money to fulfil our levelling up agenda?
Great. And 1 more question. Who wants to come in next? Gentleman just over here.
Hi, I'm from Homeless Link. We represent a lot of homeless services across the kind of regions levelling up is targeted at. I was really interested to hear Alex talk about Labour's going to be kind of going big on levelling up in the run-up to the next election. And I had a question about how much thought has gone into how that's framed. The reason I asked that is, one is I kind of agree what Ryan said, that levelling up hasn't really delivered much at all for communities, and is there a danger that the communities it's targeted at won't see the difference between a Labour's levelling up and a Tory levelling up? And the second is more about internal party health. And obviously there's been some discomfort about Labour being seen to mirror the Tories too much, and will kind of going so big on the Tories, Boris Johnson's main agenda, cause a lot of discontent within the party, do you think?
Great. So we've got Timothy's question on stamp duty, which I think is probably squarely aimed at you, Alex. Do come in on either of the other questions, and then I'll come out to the panel for the other 2 questions afterwards. So over to you to kick off.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those questions. I am, again, I'm very mindful that Lisa's speech is coming up this afternoon, so I don't want to completely, I definitely don't want to start releasing things I'm not supposed to. But I think it would be safe to say that the stamp duty reforms we saw on Friday would not have been a priority for us in government. Our analysis is more on the supply side of that. You know, so without getting too far ahead of things, you know, you're going to hear things from us on building, particularly building of different types of tenures, council house building as well, you know, because the issue is we don't have enough housing. We haven't been building at a rate that we should have done for a long time, and we can have a dust up over why that is. But that is very much the fact. So look out for that. I mean, I might just to take Mike's point on us talking about not wanting to build again, not being clear enough for manufacturing in the UK. I can't agree with that. Again, you'll see from Rachel Reeves any minute now that our pledges on precisely this are, I think, you know, amongst our boldest. We see tackling levelling up, tackling cost of living, tackling net zero as part of the same conversation. It's about resilient communities by bringing skilled work back to those communities. So, of course, that talks to the education and skills work that I mentioned at the beginning, but particularly around local communities at a sub-region, regional level, city level, whatever it is, to say these are the industries of the future that we're going to specialise in. We need our government to back us to get us going, and then to use that as a lever for private investment. So that's the model. So I can very much assure you that does involve making things in this country, skilled work in communities that have lost it over the last 40 years. And then just finally, I didn't catch the gentleman's name, the third question, but on the framing of this, I mean, I'll be honest, it's the question I've been asked the most this week is the framing. Are you going to keep levelling up on, you know, are you going to use your own name? Well, I'll be honest, I'm not very excited about that conversation, in the sense that I care most about people that we talk to, that we want to persuade that their futures are better under a Labour government, understanding what we're talking about. So the government have put a lot of effort into publicising levelling up, so that's a starting point. I don't think, you know, the fact that they're now leaving the pitch, I think that creates a separation and takes away some, perhaps, that anxiety that we're too close to them on it. But for something as fundamental as this, which is why do children in Nottingham have worse life chances than people in other parts of the country, you know, that is core Labour territory. It always has been. It's not us wearing Boris Johnson's clothes. It's Boris Johnson wearing our clothes. But as we said, it was only ever a skin-deep commitment at election time, which is what we've seen by them moving away from it as quickly as possible. Now they realise it's really hard, but we have to stick at it, and I think people will respect that, and I think it's fundamental, really, for our domestic policy.
Thanks, Alex. I'll come to you first, Zoe, maybe on the supply chains and the resilience point. I think it's particularly interesting to us.
Yeah, so I think a big answer to this is about skills, and obviously combined authorities now have control over most of the, not all of it, but of the adult education budget. And I think when we speak to business are often like, we don't get the right skills out of our local FE institutions. And when we speak to FE institutions, they say businesses can't forecast their skills need as accurately as we would want in order to be able to change all the courses that we run in order to suit businesses. So there's a bit this tension. But this is why, if, for instance, Labour did go big on something like retrofit, something we had a report out on just this week, and that would give the directional clarity to business and to FE colleges to say, this is on both fronts now. We can commit, both in terms of investment and picking where we're going to do these, where we're going to, you know, to the gentleman's point around supply chains, and where we can actually skill up the people to do this work. But I think on both sides, they need a stable and credible commitment to a long-term investment. So I think, actually picking up on some of our earlier conversation, I think, you know, as Alex said, that the mission's nothing too much to disagree with, but what they didn't give at all was a sense of prioritisation. And I think that's the clarity that's needed, both from the perspective of businesses so they can invest for the long term, both in terms of our educational institutions so they know what they're skilling up people from, and that sense of prioritisation would give that much needed clarity.
Great. Brian, did you want to come in on any of those questions?
Yeah, I mentioned before about the messaging. It's critical, but part of the change, I've been doing this work for 6, 7, 8 years now around community business. And I mentioned before you know, the phrase community business, at the beginning was like, oh, they're just calling us something else. But no, it's very specific. It's very specific in terms of commercialising community development. And you mentioned before, Ryan, about where are these people that have, that's where the answers are to these problems are in communities. And our approach is about neighbourhood enterprise, not about local enterprise or the LEP. It doesn't mean anything on a level. They're big infrastructure organisations, but I believe a lot of the answers to the problems that communities are facing are within communities. And I think it's really important that power to change's message continues through governments, and that needs to be consistent. So messaging, as I say, it needs to come from the bottom up and needs to be understood what it means at that level.
Yeah, and that's exactly why our Progressive Levelling Up project has put citizens at the heart of that research rather than kind of us as researchers for that exact purpose. Ryan, do you want to come in on anything that's been asked here?
Yeah, perhaps on the property thing, which I agree with some elements of what Alex has said, but disagree with others. I actually think from the mini budget, of all the tax cuts, the stamp duty cuts were the best. And the reason why is because it prioritised first-time buyers by increasing the relief from stamp duty quite substantially. And I've heard time and time again people say the problem with the housing market is that we don't build enough houses. And I think that is true in some areas of the country, that there is a supply-side constraint issue. But I actually think a lot of what is driving inflated house prices is also on the demand side. And two things in particular: very low interest rates that we've had for a long time has enabled borrowing at quite generous levels. But also, I think, on the demand side, the issue has been that since the financial crisis, the banks have made the requirements to get a mortgage for first-time buyers much more stringent. And so the size of the deposit that first-time buyers need is now very high, particularly in London and the southeast. And you know, we used to have a circumstance decades ago where people get 100% mortgages. Now they require a deposit to do so. So I think at the moment the market is very much tilted against first-time buyers, and by increasing the rate of relief for first-time buyers, I think it gives them a better chance against, frankly, investors and buy-to-let investors who have hoovered up in the last few decades homes that originally first-time buyers have got. Those investors have managed to get them instead. So I think the stamp duty relief thing was very important. And what I would say is, everyone says, you know, by doing that, you're inflating the property market. People also said the same thing in this cost of living crisis about if you increase cash transfers or you do tax cuts targeted at the lowest paid, well, that will just, you know, cause more inflation. The point is that if the market is going like that, prices are going like that, you have to target support at the lowest paid, even if it has a mini inflationary effect. There are other factors which are causing inflationary effects to happen, and the government needs to focus on those rather than saying we're not going to support people like first-time buyers and the lowest paid during a cost of living crisis.
So I think you just wanted to come back.
Yeah, I just to slightly come back on that, just from a regional perspective, because I guess, I mean, I think, Ryan, we actually agree on the overall sort of messages that came out of budget and how the kind of narrative now of, you know, we're backing the wealthy and hoping it all trickles down. But, I mean, here in Liverpool, you can still buy a three-bedroom terrace house for £140,000. So, you know, putting up the threshold of stamp duty relief for first-time buyers from 500,000 to 600,000, I mean, it's so blatantly a southeast policy. Do you know what I mean? And it's still going to cost the Exchequer money to do that in the most inflated part of the housing market. So I just think from a regional perspective, something that on the face of it might seem like a helpful policy to most of us not living in the southeast, you kind of think, wow, that might be my fifth house or my sixth house, not my first one. So
if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Hannah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to make that exact point that I, you know, here, even in Manchester where I live, where house prices are sort of booming, it's still, you know, most people, their first home would not cost more than £300,000. So that, you know, that hasn't really helped. I do think that housing is probably from my perspective anyway, it's the most pressing political issue. I think, just going back to what you said, Ryan, about rates of home ownership, and I think that there was actually a really interesting Economist article about why places in the northeast were voting Conservative, and it was that you know, these are places with high rates of home ownership. They're sort of two-car households, and you know, they are sort of traditional. The way people think about the northeast is sort of mining communities and things like that, but actually no, it's sort of new build estates where, you know, you have two people going to work and they own a home and run two cars, and I just thought that was interesting. But I do think housing is very, very key. And just to go back to, sorry, I can't remember your name, but the point about whether it's a Tory levelling up or a Labour levelling up. I mean, I think the opportunity for Labour there is a Tory levelling up hasn't really happened, or, you know, it hasn't happened yet, so that, you know, whatever you call it, I think, you know, there is the space to make that distinction in that, you know, if it happens, whoever delivers on that will get to own it, and so far that hasn't happened under a Conservative government. So I think there is, you know, that sort of clear blue water in between.
I just think your point about trust, though, is really important. I think trust in politicians and trust in politics has been going down for decades. And if you take those group of voters who met and voted Tory for the first time, I think Boris Johnson was right when he said their votes were lent. Yeah. And I think there will be a lot of scepticism if the Conservatives don't deliver on levelling up, that Labour will have to overcome if it wants to own that agenda. And I think the levelling up agenda so far has been so broad. The key to that is a very clear, tangible set of promises that people feel will tangibly affect their lives. And if Labour can't offer that very clear, distinct vision, I think there will be more scepticism than there was at the last election, and Labour will struggle to kind of regain that.
Can I just come back on that just a little? I mean, because first of all, I would say certainly now more than ever, all votes are lent. You know, there's very little, certainly for us, that is really, and actually I think it's a good thing, because you want to have to earn it and to really, you know, to demonstrate your value, and you'd never want someone to think that you'd taken them for granted for something as important as their vote. And there is this sense of, for communities that perhaps have voted Labour for a long time, tried that, got disillusioned, tried Brexit, it's not necessarily delivered the changes they wanted. They've tried voting for the Conservatives, as you say, as Hannah, you say, that it's not overhyping it to say that there's, you know, you're on a road to a crisis in your democracy. That's actually why, you know, because I sometimes feel I lose a bit of the room sometimes when I get onto my community power elements around that you talked about. These are not nice to have bits on the side. This is not the fluff about, you know, the sort of thing that I'm really interested, though I am. That is the way of trying to rebuild confidence by people having that proper say. You know, development's such a great example of things that generally are done to people, but are much better processes done with people. You know, we have this assumption that actually, you know, communities will resist all development. Well, actually, the conversations you have, you know, as a local councillor, are always about, well, what's the infrastructure? What will this mean on school places? What does this mean on access and roads, etc.? And if we need to change that settlement, and that's never going to be as sexy as, well, here's a £3 billion levelling up fund that's going to build new medical centres or new industrial parks. But I would argue in the long run would be much more impactful. And then just very quickly, just to touch on a point that Ryan said earlier about politicians, you know, the political timelines are a problem. Because, you know, I've said this multiple times, the government's 3-year levelling up plan is trying to address 3-4 decades of deindustrialisation. Of course, in its own terms, that is very unlikely to be successful. We will be left with that same problem, though, over a short timeline. That particularly manifests with the Treasury, you know, how to make, because at the moment, you know, Treasury Green Book rules don't point you to investment in this space. They drive you to the outcomes we currently have. So there's going to have to be reform. You're always going to have shorter-term political cycles, so you hope that political leaders can perhaps elevate themselves and commit to this agenda in the long term. But there are some structural things you could do to make that easier too.
I will come back to you. I want to take another round of questions just so we get the audience in, and then maybe we can pick up on your point then, Hannah. Sorry. So I'm going to take another round of questions. So if people could put their hands up, Ellie can bring the microphone across. Who would like to come in next? There's a gentleman just here. If any women would like, great. Fantastic. We'll come to Jade afterwards.
Hello, I'm Johan Reid Aspley from East Midlands Airport. As Alex will know, that the East Midlands has traditionally been significantly underfunded, particularly when it comes to transport investment, and even compared with our neighbours in the West Midlands. but certainly compared with the more affluent regions in the southeast. There are a couple of initiatives being looked at the moment and being considered in our region, the Freeport being one of them, at the heart of which is the airport. This is a development corporation being looked at as a way to lever in additional funding and investment. And now consideration has been given to a devolution deal. Are these the right initiatives? And also, or is it just making it a little bit more complicated?
Great. Jade at the back.
Cheers. Jade Azim on behalf of the Better Business App Coalition. So we are a campaign looking to reform directors' duties so that businesses also have obligations, not just to shareholders, but to their communities. Mostly for Alex, but I guess for the general panel. What sort of discussions have you had with sort of ethical businesses and their role in levelling up their communities and community investment? And then I'm going to cheat. Second question, for the whole panel, what sort of measures can you put in to prevent sort of the exodus from towns and say the northeast to a place like London, where obviously the housing market's overcrowded because people want jobs? How do you manage to ensure that there are opportunities for people to stay in their hometowns? Thanks.
Great question. And then Chris, just over here.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Chris. I run IPR's Commission on Health and Prosperity, and I'll ask a very predictable question, given I've said that, which is there are obviously very wide, almost grotesque health inequalities across the country. We know that has a human cost, but it also increasingly shows up as an economic cost. We know things like economic inactivity is increasingly suppressed by poor health and by health inequalities. So my question is just, how does that fit, do you think, in the Labour levelling up agenda? And how can we make sure it's integral rather than just a nice to have at the side?
Great. So I'll come to you first, Alex. We've got transport and underinvestment, particularly in the East Mids. We've got directors' duties and also excess of people from kind of areas without jobs. And we've got health inequalities.
Just a small range there, then.
So you can solve that in there.
I'll start with the East Midlands, because Johan and I have been having these conversations for a very long time. I mean, Johan, as you know, I'm not particularly enthusiastic about free ports in terms of their impact to the national economy. I'm much more enthusiastic about Development Corporation. You know, your site is the prime example, based in Leicestershire, but serving Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire across multiple local authorities at a planning level. And then when you add, you know, the major East Midlands Airport, biggest pure freight airport in the country, but largely served by single track roads, which creates chaos. But the planning to change that's really hard too. So throwing a net over the site to create a better kind of development environment that brings employers into it, because again, yours is a huge story of private investment and private support. I think that's a better model. On the deals point of view, yes, well, you know, we want to see for wherever, you know, across the country, those combined authorities to get those devolved powers, as I say. I mean, I'm against deals in themselves. I've hated this asymmetric model of Whitehall deciding whose leaders are good enough to have what powers. I think that's a bit daft. I think we're in a better place now, actually, post the white paper, in terms of a presumption on pushing to everyone getting the fullest powers where they want them, and we would go a lot harder on that in government. Jade, because this is the point that gets lost in levelling up, because levelling up could quite quickly become a north versus south, or the rest of the country versus London thing, which fails the agenda, because for exactly as you say, and I follow your tweets on this, and you know, the housing market stuff makes my hair curl. Very hard to relate to in Nottingham for all the reasons you say. We've got great family housing you can get that people can afford. But so London and Londoners lose too, because whether it's people who are born in London and can't have to leave the community that they were born in and love because they can't afford to live there. How sad's that? On the business element, yeah, you know, the work you're doing is very important here. As you know, I'm very enthusiastic about co-ops and, you know, those sorts of alternative models that do put community value at the heart of it. And again, you know, we're pushing hard for manifesto commitments around that. Would always appreciate support. And then, Chris, I knew you'd mention health at some point. I did think, oh, I've not said it yet. Chris will tell the panelists off. I mean, health is really important in this agenda as both symptom and cause. And, you know, I always say, you know, Nottingham, we've got, particularly my constituency, we tend to be on the worst end of all health inequalities. And it isn't because our burgers are bigger or our cigarettes twice as long or our beer isn't 10% proof. It's as a result of our poverty, it manifests in these ways. So there's just a bit of a chicken and egg that we've got to tease through about how you crack that, because we have a huge group of people now. We look at the employment story of the last 20 years plus, you've got that huge group of people not set on unemployment benefits, but on ill health benefits, with much greater prospects of never working than they have of working again. And that's a real priority group, I think.
Great. Zoe, do you want to come in on any of those points?
Loads of really great questions there, thank you. Firstly, just on sort of initiative overlap, I think the same thing can be said also for funding streams to local areas and combined authorities. On last count, Greater Manchester Combined Authority had over 50 funding streams from local government, which you can imagine that's at least one person's full-time job just to make sure they're all connected up and speaking to one another. So simplification, keeping it simple. If I was Alex, I would want to definitely rationalise and bring together a lot of the initiatives that have been layered on top of each other over the last few years. Just picking up the point that was made on socially traded businesses, I was just talking to Kindred LCR the other day, who are a great organisation here in Liverpool who work exactly with socially traded, social purpose businesses. And I think increasingly the question is just how can we scale them? I know a lot of combined authorities, especially up in the north of Tyne, as well as here in Liverpool City region, are going in on socially traded businesses with businesses and the combined authority together. But obviously that's seen as a sort of first take in the hope that that shows the model works. So I think it's a question of scale. I think really nice question on kind of exodus and how we allow people to stay in the places that they were born or want to continue living in. I think there's a lot of answers to that question. A few things I would highlight. I think in places where the social housing stock is maintained, obviously with Right to Buy, we have a situation at the moment where houses are sold from social rent sector into the private sector without a replacement. Now, the government did promise there would be at least a one-to-one replacement of housing stock. That's not happening. Therefore, we're seeing, through the Right to Buy policy being maintained, a massive decline in the social housing stock, as well as a very limited new buildings. So that would be one thing I would suggest could be a good step for Labour. Secondly, on land value capture, so that's about, the minute that a new transport link or something is put on to, is planned onto land locally, the value of that land goes massively up and that's all captured by the landowner. Is there a better way to share that benefit of that land uplift to the benefit of the community, to pay for public services, local infrastructure locally? And then just finally on health, here in Liverpool, the average woman will have a healthy life expectancy of 58. So on average, you can expect to have 10 years of poor health before you even get to retire. I mean, I just think it's ultimately the ultimate indicator of levelling up. And if we can't improve that metric, then what's the economy for, and what's the life we're all trying to lead? Surely it's a healthy, good life. And so I would always put healthy life expectancy really at the top of the pile in terms of ultimately what is ever levelling up setting out to do.
Brian, do you want to come in on any of those points?
Yes. How do we get people to stay? I really haven't framed the work that we've done. I've led Safe Regeneration over the past 15 years to develop a project in Bootle, which is just north of the city, 0.5 most deprived community in the UK, so there's a lot of problems there. But we've developed a project which has just tipped over £40 million, a community-led housing, enterprise and commercial space. That's how you do it. You do it with support of organisations like Power to Change, and you invest in people, and you trust people to make those decisions, and you trust people and their passion to be able to overcome the issues that they face. So with people that are designed where they live and where they work and how they work, people are much more likely to stay where they were brought up, I believe.
Great. Ryan, I'm going to come to you. I wanted to ask in particular about the keeping people in places point, because I think for a long time the conservative kind of neoliberal economic policy has been to lean into growth wherever that might happen, often in the south, and for people to move towards that growth and that prosperity. It felt like the levelling up agenda was a kind of move away from that, to say that actually the state can steer the type, the quality, the nature of growth, including in places that have previously been left behind. Is Friday a reversion back to the old model, and should we be kind of doing more to allow people to stay in places and get good jobs, and how should we be doing that?
So just quickly, I agree with you about mini budget seems to be a shift. I disagree slightly that the past few decades have been a kind of neoliberal sort of experiment. I don't agree with that. But on the point about, Jade's point about keeping talent, I mean, I think the first thing to say is to be a little bit cautious, which is, there is this sort of tension between mobility and freedom and community and belonging. And it is fine for young people to go and live in a big city with bright lights and good career, and then maybe come back later. So we don't necessarily want them to stay there. Maybe they'll go, and then it's a life cycle thing. As they have children, for example, they might want to put their roots down somewhere else, and that's fine as well. So we don't want to be seeming, don't just seem like we're stopping people from pursuing their ambitions. So that's the first thing to say. And also the other thing, the Sutton Trust, which is a social mobility think tank, did some very interesting work which looked at people who experience long-haul social mobility. So that's people who start off in the bottom income deciles and then go up to the top income deciles by the time they're in their mid-late 30s. And interestingly, about 2/3 of those people actually lived within 15 miles of where they grew up. So this idea of the Dick Whittington story of everybody moving to London and that's how they become very prosperous is actually somewhat exaggerated. I mean, it does happen a bit, but actually a lot of people don't necessarily live exactly in the same town that they grew up in, but in a village which is probably a little bit more prosperous, 10 miles out. So just to sort of slightly challenge that narrative that everyone's going to London, it isn't actually the case from the data that I've seen. But there is obviously an issue around it. I mean, one, quite a cynical argument would be that if the housing market continues to motor on in London, then people get priced out and then have to move elsewhere. I mean, that's not an attractive argument to say, but it could have the economic impact of moving people to areas outside of London and the southeast. Few things, though, where I think you could attract people to stay or come back to so-called left-behind areas. The first thing is making sure the connections to the big cities are there. There's been a big focus on HS2, connecting cities around the country to London. I also think you need to make sure that areas, smaller towns and villages are well connected to cities like Liverpool and Manchester. And I think that's very important. I think the second thing is flexible working and hybrid working, which has obviously become normalized a lot more since the pandemic, making sure that there's sort of equitable access to that, so that people can live outside of metropolitan areas. I think that's really important and helpful to the spread of the population. The other thing is, particularly as I talked about in my opening speech, about attracting talent to work in key public services in left-behind areas. Can we think about salary supplements? There is a salary supplement for people who live in London because of the cost of living in some professions. Can we think about extending salary supplements in teaching, for example, or childcare or social care for those people who work in so-called left-behind areas? So can incentivize them with higher salaries? Can we use that as a mechanism? And the other thing is to think about the prestige and the awards and the incentives that you might get as a successful person to invest in your area and come back to your area. How can we think about how we motivate that and incentivize people through awards, prestige, that sort of thing? I think that's also an important thing to think about.
Fantastic. And to round us up, Hannah, do you want to close?
Yeah, so to sort of touch on Jade's point about the exodus, I would say the pandemic, that's, one positive that has come out of it is this approach to flexible, hybrid, remote working, and you see jobs that would have been in London. There's a lot more flexibility among employers to consider, allowing people to work outside of London, and that's a positive. But what I would say is it's not just about jobs, it's about the wider environment that you live in, and what's attractive about London and the bigger cities is not just the employment market, it's also the culture, it's the restaurants, it's live music, it's theatre, it's things like that. And no one's saying that you're going to get sort of headline bands and Michelin-starred restaurants maybe coming to somewhere like Burnley, but it's Ryan's point about the transport links. So I think that's really key, that you have to make it attractive beyond beyond just the jobs. You have to make these places attractive for people to live, either within the cities themselves or by providing opportunities for people to access a good standard of living by sort of travelling reasonably. I mean, sort of one train an hour stopping at 10 o'clock. That's just not on a par with somewhere like London, where you've got the tube running all night and everything's on your doorstep. So I think that's really key. And on Chris's point about the health inequalities, I just think it's sort of a chicken and egg. There was some data out last week. You'll probably know a lot more than me, but I saw about people who are not economically active, and that those numbers have gone up, and that's it was really interesting. I just read something on it about how people are living longer because they're living with these long-term conditions, and these are people who in the past might have died, but that's a real sort of issue with an aging population and with things like that. And just, I don't know if this is still, you might know, but this is still a correct statistic, but where I used to live in North London, there was a train line that went through to Tottenham, and it was that life expectancy sort of decreased by, I can't remember, was it 2 years or something, by each stop that you went along. So I think, we talk about levelling up and we think about sort of the north versus the south, but actually within cities, London has some of the worst child poverty, and you look at levelling up, and even like within Manchester, where I live, you have this exodus of sort of, I grew up in North Manchester, but people like me and moved to South Manchester, and there's this huge gulf in house prices even there, because you don't have the facilities, the things that I talked about just earlier. So I don't really know what point I'm trying to make there, but yeah, there's some observations.
Thank you. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to draw us to a close. Thank you for everyone for coming to today's event, for braving the weather. It looks like it's got a bit nicer since we've been sitting in here. Thank you to our panel, especially to Bright Blue, for partnering with us. If anyone is going to Tory Party Conference next week, please come and join us again. Thank you to Alex for joining us and for giving us an overview of Labour's current position. We really look forward to working with you all over the next year or two as we lead towards a general election. We've made levelling up and our project one of the most important things we're doing in the next few years, just because we know it is such an important issue. It's not an electoral game. It's not just a slogan, or it shouldn't be. It should be about getting a country that really does deliver for everybody wherever you're born. And we're really keen to make sure that both Labour and the Conservatives go into the next election with a really big, bold offer to the country that addresses the kind of burning injustices, the inequalities we see. So please do join us on that journey, feed into the conversation. Today is the start, not the end of that conversation, so we look forward to continuing it and working with you all. Thank you very much. One final thing I should have said, which is thank you very much to Power to Change for both supporting today's event, but also for supporting our research, because we wouldn't be able to do it without them. Thank you very much.